We already talked about public funding versus private funding. We said at least for some students we need public funding. We now talk about public versus private provision. That to me is still a separate issue from a third thing, which is choice or competition. You could have a system that's all publicly provided, but there's still competition among the schools for students. Now, how would you rate the issue of public versus private provision versus the issue of competition versus, I'll call it monopoly supply? So for example, I'm the only provider. Maybe it's a private provider. What if I were to turn CPS over to a private provider and say, you're the only provider of education for kids that live within the boundary of Chicago Public Schools? Would that be a solution? We've gotten rid of government provision. Government provision is out the window. It's now run by same guys who run the parking meters in Chicago. That'll solve our problem, right? Because we've privatized, got rid of this evil government provision.
The root of the issue is not who signs your paycheck, whether it's some nonprofit organization or whether it's a private firm or whether it's a government agency. The first and most important principle is, does that organization that signs your check, do they have to compete with other providers to please parents? Do they have to provide quality education in order to get the income to write your check?
That's the element of competition. That is, the providers have to compete for the customers.
Right, and you can have choice without competition.
So that principal, go back to your starting point, that principal who hires all his relatives who are lousy teachers,
right,
is going to be greatly limited in his ability to do that,
right,
if he doesn't get any students when he does that.
Right.
That costs him
right
in the market for students.
And there's a second issue I want to make here that relates to the way we do labor law. You can have a market that has 30, 40 different organizations running schools.
So now, let me give you your example. So your example is, I now take CPS, I don't just make it private. I now take each school and I give each school to a separate private organization.
Right.
And I tell each of these schools, you got to compete against the other schools. If people would rather go to that other school, you're not going to get any students anymore.
Right. So you can have that situation, but if you then pass a law or make it very easy for the Chicago Teachers Union to organize all of those schools under one contract with one set of work rules, one set of pay, one set of hiring rules, one set of school hours, one way that you can run a school. Because basically, if you have all these work rules for the teachers written out in the contract, you're kind of 80% of the way of determining exactly how you have to run the school. So if you allow that situation, well, now people are still competing for students, but you've greatly constrained their ability to innovate and do creative things as part of the competition. It's like having a football league where you say, okay, everybody has to run the same plays. Everybody has to run the same offense. Everybody has to do exactly the same thing. You don't get the same out of the competition. And so I think it's very important to not only have many different types of organizations competing for families and for students, but to have an environment where they can innovate in terms of the way they hire teachers, the way they run schools, the work hours, the way they organize instruction. They can really do innovative, creative things where you can get the benefits of the competition.
Isn't it actually worse than that? I mean, let's assume I set up the system. I got all these separate schools. and I require them all to hire from the same pool of teachers. Compensate them all the same based on how many years you're out of school and whether you have a master's degree. And that's it. That's all there is. So some schools are going to have really good students, and I'm going to get paid the same wherever I go. I probably want to be in the school with the good students. Aren't the students, the most needy students, going to end up with the worst instruction in that world? You might think it's a system that lends itself to equality because I'm telling you have to treat everybody equally. But there's still going to be competition, but it's going to be of a very different sort. It's going to be a competition that's actually going to probably lead to what many people consider worse outcomes, not better outcomes.
I think you see that in the data now.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? You look in large districts with one set of salary schools and one set of work rules for all the schools, and you don't get the best teachers in the neediest neighborhoods. You don't get the best teachers in the disadvantaged neighborhoods. You get the best teachers in the schools that have the most advantaged kids.
And that may be efficient, it may not be efficient, but it's going to be the outcome in a system like that, no matter whether it's efficient or not.
And it's going to amplify inequality. You mentioned this earlier, and I think one thing that's really been left out of a lot of education policy debates, because I think it makes everything complicated because now you get into optimal tax and other distortions. Economists should put more effort into exploring the idea that the amount of public funding that your kid gets is not a constant across everyone. I don't think there's any efficiency grounds for the public providing a subsidy to the educational investments that you and I made in our kids. We were going to make the absolute same investments whether or not we had to pay for it all or whether the government subsidized it. And I think there's a research agenda that economists should be much more involved in about what's the optimal gradient. A very disadvantaged kid should be getting more funding from the government than a very advantaged kid. We should be asking the most advantaged families to contribute more to the education of their own children so that the kids that come from disadvantaged circumstances that actually require more investment to reach what we would consider, kind of being college ready, or these different marks that we think of in education. That's another part of it. And that also helps with this idea of getting more talented people to work with the kids from more disadvantaged circumstances. If you're allocating more, you can pay more.
Yeah, it's hard though in a system if you don't allow, let's say we decided we wanted to improve the quality of the teaching workforce. In a system where everybody gets paid the same regardless of
what they teach
or how well they teach.
Right.
Pretty difficult to upgrade quality in a world
yeah.
like that because I can't pay people more for being more productive.
Right.